Hey everyone, welcome to the Camino Cafe. I am so glad that you decided to join us here in the cafe to talk all things Camino. And today is the day before St. James Feast Day, and it got me to thinking about a couple of things. And most of you that have listened to past podcasts or have watched us on YouTube, you know that I'm probably one of the world's biggest Camino geeks, and I love finding out stuff about the Camino. And I'm also a Catholic. And as St. James Day started approaching this year, I started realizing, I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but I don't think I know that much about St. James. And so that got me to thinking that maybe people that are listening to this podcast or watching our YouTube channel might be feeling the same way. So I thought, what can I do to help out in this? And I thought, well, I'm going to call my good friend, Father Steven, and see if he might be willing, very impromptu, to see if he might be willing to come back to the Camino Cafe and talk about St. James. And many of you have probably already remember Father Steven. We interviewed him back in January, and he came on to talk about Warriors on the Way, which is his 501c3 that he runs, which is just an amazing program where he is taking people on the Camino that have suffered mortal injury. And so we will talk about that a little bit more. I'm sure that will come up as we talk. But if you want to go back and watch those episodes, that was back in January. And we did 2 episodes with Father Steven back then. But today it's going to be about St. James mostly. So Father Steven, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on and agreeing to talk about St. James. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you for having me on again. It's always such a pleasure to be able to be in conversation with you and be part of the Camino Cafe. You're a great podcast host and just love being on your show. So you say, reach out to see if I'd be willing. It's like always willing. The only question is the time available? And you caught me at the perfect time. I had a day available to jump on and put a little bit of information together, and glad to help educate other pilgrims about St. James and the reason why we walk, or at least the reason why the pilgrimage got started.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there are so many stories out there about him. And I wanted to just kind of start off with a quote. I don't know if anyone at home has this book, but I think there's a really great quote that talks about St. James in the introduction. And I just wanted to start off with this. The story of St. James has been written so often as to be trite in its retelling. Honed over centuries of discoveries, interpretations, claims, and counterclaims, it lies somewhere between legend and fact, between superstition and belief. Yet, whether it is a true or only wished to be true, it has motivated pilgrimages for over 1,000 years. So I read that and I thought, yeah, I think that kind of fits, because I'll hear different little bits of stories or facts about him or see things while I'm on Camino. So I thought that was maybe a good landing spot for us to start as we begin to talk about St. James. And so what's your thought on that quote? Does that ring true to you when you hear that?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely true. And I'll say, as you contacted me yesterday and said, would this be available? I thought the first thing that we have to include is what we know versus what we believe. And when I say what we believe, the we is kind of loose in its definition. What we believe, at least as far as how it has motivated the Camino. And there's a few points of detail that can be the background, what we believe about it. And I must admit, I tend to go way down into those details, which I'm not going to do too much today, or I hope not anyway, because it does tend to cause people's eyes to glaze over as you start talking about, this little piece of evidence versus that one and how they're held in tension with each other. But I want to give at least a decent overview as to some of the things that we have, reasons to believe, reasons why there's some question, and talk about St. James that way, and then how it's kind of evolved into the pilgrimage today.
Yeah, that sounds really good. Yeah, so St. James is the patron saint of pilgrimages and the patron saint of Spain. So when you're in Spain, you see a lot of St. James representation. So I guess let's start with maybe explain a little bit about why there's such a connection to the Camino with St. James, in your
Well,
opinion.
okay. I'm going to back up just a little bit from there and say, St. James, because even, as a Camino geek, and you confess yourself to be, and I am as well, and as a church geek, it is occupational hazard. It's still hard to keep track of all the biblical characters, right? And so we've got St. James, who is the Santiago of Spain. In Santiago, St. James. Well, there's at least 3 or 4 other James. James was clearly a popular name. Yeah, in the era Jacobi. And so we've got multiple people talked about in the Bible as James, and many of them went on to sainthood. So we've got St. James the Greater, which means he was either older or larger, and St. James the Less, which means he was either younger or smaller. It was not a comment about their importance. And then we've got St. James the Just, and we've got all of these different St. Jameses that are all have at some point or other a touch point in the New Testament text. And so St. James the Greater is the Santiago of the Camino, and he's one of the original 12 disciples. His brother was John. They were both professional fishermen prior to being called to their discipleship and being followers of Jesus, and ultimately apostles. And it's an interesting thing, for those who don't know, that if a disciple is one who's learning, an apostle is one who is sent. And so all of the disciples became apostles when they were given the commission to go spread the gospel. And that's where we start moving to the point of how we believe James ultimately ended up in Spain on a missionary journey. Each of the different apostles is believed to go to a different part of the world. Thomas, for example, went to India. James, we believe, went to Spain. And so that's how we have James in Spain. That's how we have Santiago, and ultimately the pilgrimage after, which started after his martyrdom and his body being returned to Spain by those who were on that missionary journey with him. So that's what we know about him, right? That's what we know from the biblical text. And then what we believe about him, because we don't have significant documentation of his being in Spain. The Bible is filled with St. Paul writing, first I went here and then I went there, and this other place was great, and this place was they treated me horribly. Paul documented everything to an extreme extent. St. James and really the majority of the disciples, they simply went out on their missionary journeys and didn't write back about it. They went and did the job that Jesus gave them to do, and that's it. So we don't have the significant extant documentation of James being in Spain that we do for Paul being on his many journeys. That's the most well documented, and Thomas, a reasonable amount of documentation of him going to India. But there are things primarily from the various traditions that place James in Spain, and that includes the story of Our Lady of Pilar that we'll get to in a little bit. And so this is what we know about James. We get him there. The Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, were classified as pagan countries, and the apostles were largely very energized evangelists, and so they ran afoul of the government, and ultimately James was called before Herod Agrippa, who was the Roman appointed governor of Jerusalem at the time, So he had to return to Jerusalem. And in the year 44, he was beheaded for basically upsetting the government. And then what we believe to have occurred is that his body was then recovered and transported back to Spain. And there's some great stories. And this is where that terrific quote that you've just read from the book is so true, because there's a variety of small variations. They're not huge variations, but small variations as to how that occurred. And so some will say that he was transported by boat, and then others was like, well, it was not just a boat, but it was a boat without a sail, or it was a boat without a rudder, or I've even read it was a stone boat, so without a sail and without a rudder. So it shouldn't have floated to begin with, and then it was miraculously transported to the coast of Spain. And it does seem that in some of the storytelling that there was a bit of one-upsmanship going on among those telling the stories.
Right.
But we do have, we have reason to believe in just the kind of agreed upon traditional oral history that he was transported to Spain, regardless of whether the boat was miraculous or not.
Right.
And then there's a variety of interesting things as to, well, did the boat actually make it to shore? Well, the miraculously guided boats did. Just being transported by boat, well, the crew ended up crashing it, sinking it. And so, one of the stories explaining the shell is that when his body washed up on shore, it was covered in the shells that were clinging to his burial wrapping, right? So there's all types of stories that as to little details, and like a lot of stories get told by people who are trying to fill in the blanks of what we don't have actually documented. So I'm a St. James believer. I'm a Spanish St. James believer. So I do believe that he was successfully transported to Spain. I do believe that his relics are in the sepulcher there below the main altar in the basilica, in the cathedral. But as to exactly how that occurred, I think that's a little bit more flexible as to just how rock solid some of those stories are.
Yeah, I wanted to say, and thank you for all of that. I think that was really great, just the things you've already shared. When I was doing a little bit of research last night, I saw that St. James was, on that boat with Jesus where, he talks about become a fisherman of men.
Right.
And I thought such an exciting, I did not realize that, he was the disciple that was in that situation. I didn't realize it was the same James. So I wonder if you could just touch upon that. And do you think that is there any documentation that you're aware of that James would have been selected to be the one to go to the Iberian Peninsula?
Okay, so first, let's go back to the calling of James. James and his brother John, sons of a man named Zebedee, according to the text. And right, it's a great story because they get there. There they are, and the gospel text tells us that they are tending their nets. So they've been out fishing, and now, just like any professional tradesperson, they are cleaning and tending, making any repair, doing whatever maintenance, so that their tools of the trade are ready for the next day. And Jesus comes along and says, follow me and become fishers. If you're reading an older translation of the text, it'll say fishers of men. A newer translation of the text will say fishers of people. Clearly, Jesus was talking about all of humanity. He wasn't, creating Christianity for males only. So fishers of people is a perfectly good translation of the text. And James and John drop their nets and say goodbye to dad and turn and follow Jesus instantly without any hesitation.
Wow.
And so it's this great story in that it just is a way of demonstrating or a way of expressing the somehow they understood the magnitude of this mission that they were being called to. Because whether you're a person of faith or not, the reality that one leader, Jesus, and 12 selected followers could literally change the world. I mean, our calendar is based on the estimated birth of Christ. You know, the majority of the world is in one way or another governed by ideals that were expressed through the teachings of Jesus.
Yeah.
We frequently say Judeo-Christian values. I shy away from that term because prior to Christ coming on the scene, the stoning of people and some rather brutal punishments were still being carried out in the Jewish population. That's not to pick on them. It's just reflective of the age. But a completely different way of dealing with humanity, a much more kind, a much more gentle, a much more grace-filled way of dealing with humanity was introduced through the teachings of Jesus. So whether or not you're a person of faith or not, the entire world got changed, and how we interact with one another was changed by one person with 12 followers. That's amazing. That's amazing just by itself.
Absolutely. And I started thinking about just how you described John and James just dropping everything, right? And deciding to follow and become disciples. It's kind of a cool, I don't know, a connection to the Camino for me, because, you know, that's what we're called to do, is we kind of drop our regular life and walk the Camino. And I think from that moment, we see this man who becomes a saint was willing to do that and to just kind of take off and go and take on this effort. So it just kind of like, wow, he was a pilgrim from the very beginning.
Yeah, that's an excellent way to look at it.
Yeah. So do you, going back to, do you think he was selected to go to Iberia for any particular reason, or, you know, how were they assigned, or did they just kind of go where they wanted to go? Is there anything that documents that?
Yeah, we don't have a real clear record, not at least not that I'm familiar with. There's reason to believe that he would be, James and John were not the only fishermen that were selected to become disciples. I mean, in fact, most of them were fishermen, which I like to point out. Commercial fishing is a really hard job today. It was even harder then without modern machinery. So the rather stereotype Christian male is weak and just kind of sort of a milquetoast individual is completely against the biblical record. You know, Jesus picked only like the hardiest of individuals to be his followers. But we could, with, I think, a pretty reasonable level of security, theorize that those that did have the commercial fishing background would have been more inclined to do overseas missions that required a sailing component to arrive at their mission field. But that would be a theory. I wouldn't know. I couldn't say that for certain.
Okay. So some of the, just a little bit I know is that he takes off to the Iberian area, and the missionary is really not a big success. He really took on a pretty challenging assignment for that area. So maybe we can go into a little bit on what kind of happens next. So he's there, he's, if I'm correct, just kind of getting a handful of converts, and it's not really going so great. Is that what you've heard as well?
Right. Yeah, very much. That's a good point. Everything north and the whole area of Europe was pagan country, and pagan in the definition of those that were going out from Jerusalem. And so in Jerusalem, you had the Jewish population. Of course, Jesus himself was Jewish, right? And what he's saying is, okay, this is how you truly live and fulfill the requirements of the faith. And so there was, for those who did missionary work right there in the area, there was much more of a, like you were already 2/3 of the way to understanding what I'm talking about, versus going to Spain, going to France, going to the British Isles. These are areas that had it. What faith there was more pantheistic. Can't pronounce it. Pantheistic, much more nature religion, or if you get far enough north, you get your Norse gods and things like this. So not just a lack of faith, but a faith that came from a distinctly different background, a different foundation. So where those that were in Jerusalem might have been saying, okay, you've learned these things so far, now let me tell you the rest of the story. St. James went into the Iberian Peninsula and said, let me tell you something you've never heard before, you've got no background in, and it's really going to completely upset your apple cart because it's a completely different understanding of God. But trust me, it's the truth. And yeah, he was running up against a brick wall, and had some success, but really minimal. And that is to the point of anybody that's in ministry. If you talk to them and you get them in that moment of honesty, they're going to say, yeah, there's days that you just want to quit because you're not seeing any success. You're not seeing and experiencing that what you're doing is effective. And if you're not being effective, you start doubting what you're doing. And it was at that point, according to what we have in the history and the tradition of the church, as it was at that point in the year 40 that Mary appeared to St. James in Spain to give him encouragement, to tell him he was doing the right thing, to keep evangelizing, that his work was being honored by Jesus, and motivated him to continue. And that happened in the region in and around Zaragoza. And Mary appeared to James standing on a pillar, so this elevated position, and it's the first Marian apparition recorded in the church. And the interesting thing about it is, in the year 40, we have every reason to believe that Mary was still alive in Jerusalem. And so it is an occasion of what's referred to as bilocation, that she was in two places at one time.
Oh, wow.
And so it's a great story, just in the encouragement. I like any story where someone comes along and encourages another. But what I really like about it, and it's physically represented in the apparition, and that Mary is elevated. And it's this elevated place of this wonderful woman who's able to come in, and in an area and an era of a completely male-dominated society. Was it one of the other apostles that said, "Oh, I hear James is having a hard time, let me go give him some help"? No, it's a woman who comes to his aid. It's Mary who comes to his aid and is able to speak those words of encouragement. And again, if you're a person of faith, this just dovetails perfectly into your faith. And if you're not a person of faith, then it's simply an excellent example of how men and women should work together, that we should encourage one another, that we each have our own skills and gifts, and we bring them to bear on whatever the circumstances are, and treat each other as good and worthy equals.
Yes. Oh, wow. So much there. I love this. So
And
that
I,
story, or the story of this, of Mary visiting him is not as well known as some other stories of her appearing. Why do you think that is?
that is true, and I would love to know the reason why that is. But yeah, if you're in the United States and you have even a nominal recognition of the Marian apparitions, you've heard of Our Lady of Lourdes, Our Lady of Fatima. That's France and Portugal, especially big in the American Southwest and through Central America, Our Lady of Guadalupe. And then, of course, the devotion to her is expanding through the rest of the United States as the Latin American population continues to populate the U.S. in rather than just in the Southwest. And of course, each apparition occurs for a specific reason, and those are popular for the reasons they're popular, and the lack of popularity, the lack of being well known for Our Lady of the Pillar, or Nuestra Señora de Pilar, is kind of a mystery to me, because it is the first apparition. It ought to be huge. It ought to be held out as distinct. It's the first ever occasion of bilocation, and there's a few stories of bilocation, but this is the first. So it's the first Marian apparition. It's the first story of any saint bilocating, and so I don't know why it doesn't get more traction, so to speak, in the popular Marian devotion. I think this apparition deserves it, but the again, only working on a guess, is that it was very much focused on assisting Santiago, assisting St. James, and encouraging him. You get the other Marian apparitions, and she appears to one person, two people, three people, and it says, now this is what I want the community to do. And it's typically a message of increasing their prayer life, having a better sense of the need for repentance and penance, in order to conform their life to the teachings of the gospel. These are different messages that come through the different Marian apparitions. And so maybe that's why, because then you can say, oh, that's a message to me. That's a message to all of humanity, of which I'm part. So that's a message to me. Whereas Our Lady of the Pillar is very much a message to Santiago. You need to continue. You're doing good work. You're going to be rewarded by the Heavenly Father. Yeah. Don't give up. Don't give up yet. Keep at it. So because of the real tight focus as to the appearance, that might be it. But I think there's a lot more to the appearance than just that message that gives reason that it should be better known. But
yeah, I agree with you. Because you'll hear people talk about, if they're doing the Portuguese route, that they will take the alternate route to go to Fatima. But I until we started talking about this, I had never really heard anyone even talk about the Zaragoza connection and the Lady of Pilar. So I find this so interesting. Now, when she comes to visit him, does she instruct him, do we think, to build this cathedral, or?
Right. Yeah. And when all's said and done, and she gives the encouragement, and this is pretty typical, with just about all the Marian apparitions, is an instruction. It's like, okay, now build a church on this spot,
Okay.
and it will persist. And sure enough, the church there, the basilica there in Zaragoza is still there. And it's a beautiful, wonderful facility, and definitely go and check it out for great architecture, great church architecture. Uh, I love looking at churches. You can kind of tell when they've been built based on, is it Romanesque? Is it medieval? Is it, I don't have my church terms flowing off the tip of my tongue at the moment. I apologize, but you can kind of get an idea of the age based on how the walls are designed, how the ceiling is, how they buttress the walls, how much glass is in there. But there's always, the church and how it's built always has a story to tell in and of itself. So take a side trip over if you've got a couple extra days and enjoy that. Especially as we were talking before we got started, especially if you're there in that second week of October leading up to the 12th for the huge fiesta of Our Lady of Pilar. Zaragoza's 9-day long fiesta celebrating this apparition. And so definitely something to go and participate in. And I have an idea for all your viewers. If I can put up a couple pictures. These are a couple photos that I've taken along the way, because pilgrims, and I'm glad we've included this part of the story of Santiago, because pilgrims, whether or not they know anything about St. James or not, quickly learn to recognize St. James. They learn to recognize St. James in the now starting to fade away Matamoros pose on the white charger, sword drawn, trampling the Moors underfoot. The more common, much more popular, and ever growing more popular, pilgrim St. James with floppy hat and staff and shell. You start seeing the red cross, and that's St. James. You start seeing the shell, and you realize that's St. James. But all along the way, you'll see representations of Our Lady of the Pillar, and without realizing that she's got a direct St. James, an absolute direct St. James connection, they're going to be largely ignored. So I want to show your viewers a couple images that I've taken, and then make a little offer. And I took both of these on the Camino, right? So I'm going to ask for more information than just that they're on the Camino. And one is a large piece of outdoor statuary, and one is a tabletop piece that would have been, like, say, an altar piece of statuary. And I'm going to put those up, and you'll see how. Let's see how I get to. Where'd my little share button go? It was on here before. Oh, I think maybe when we reset the recording.
Yeah.
So while you're resetting that, I'll just say, I want to offer the first person who is able to identify specifically where either of these is. So that'll be one each, one that's on the left side and one that's on the right side. And please, when you contact me, say, I'm talking about the one on the left or the one on the right. I want to offer a Warriors on the Way t-shirt to the first person that can identify either the left or the right, specifically where I took these photos. A fun bit of Camino trivia, I hope.
So I'm wearing one of the t-shirts.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, let's see the pictures. I made you host, so you should be able to do that now.
Okay. So we're gonna hit that right there, and it should come up. And you see that? You got that on your screen now?
Yes.
Okay, so you see the one on the left, nice piece of outdoor statuary, then the one on the right. And so you can see in both of these how she gets her name, Our Lady of the Pillar, is that she's standing on that pillar, holding the infant Jesus, and from there, speaking her words of encouragement to Santiago, to St. James. And
wow.
I've taken both of these photos on the Camino, and I'll give your watchers a little bit of more of a help in that I took both of them from somewhere between, because I took somewhere between Leon at the earliest and Santiago de Compostela at the latest. So it's somewhere in that segment of the Frances. Both of them are somewhere along the segment of the Frances.
Are they both in the same area, or will there be two answers? They're in separate
No,
areas.
it's two separate answers. And so
Okay.
with an opportunity for two separate people to obtain t-shirts.
Okay.
And all you got to do is email me at warriorsontheway@gmail.com. So warriorsontheway@gmail.com. And if you can identify the left or the right side where those photos were taken, I will and send your address and your preferred t-shirt size. I will send in the and I'm sorry I have to limit this to people responding from the United States because for the limitation on my postage, my budget for postage. But I will send out a t-shirt to the first person that identifies the left and the first person who identifies the right.
Okay. So if you are watching this on, or if you're listening on the podcast, you can flip over to our YouTube channel to see the two pictures. So the first person to get back to Father Steven is going to win a t-shirt. This is awesome. Thank you. That is so kind to do that. And it's wonderful to be able to actually now see the photos of what you've been talking about. And, I've seen, Mary depicted on this and had no idea of the connection to St. James. So I'm finding this so fascinating. Thank you for sharing this part with us. I can't wait to now go back and start picking these out, and now knowing, really this very deep meaning to her coming to visit James. This is really incredible.
Okay. So yeah, it's a great part of the overall story, and glad to help people see one more layer of the history of St. James. And otherwise it simply becomes another piece of iconography that you don't necessarily understand, and therefore it just fades into the background. And instead, it should be something that you say, oh, that's actually part of the pilgrimage. That's part of the St. James story, and why we're here, and what has motivated pilgrims for over 1,000 years, and what has caused Santiago de Compostela to be one of the top, not just one of the oldest pilgrimage routes, but one of the most heavily trafficked pilgrimage route. And people talk about going to Rome, they talk about going to Jerusalem when they talk about going on pilgrimage. Sometimes they'll talk about going to Greece if they're a devotee of the Apostle Paul. And we hear about that a lot, but they don't realize that Santiago de Compostela is the third oldest pilgrimage route in Christendom. And it is, especially with the incredible work to revitalize it that started earlier in the 20th century, about the 30s, as people started paying attention again. But really, and now his name slips my mind, but the priest that was assigned to the parish church there in Osobero in the 70s, and he went just so in detail in getting the route reestablished, getting it cleared, building the infrastructure, making it possible for the common person to be able to make this pilgrimage successfully. Literally millions of pilgrims owe their pilgrimage opportunity to the dedicated work of a priest on a mountaintop post that looked around and said, people need to be doing this, and they're not doing it because it's hard. Yes. And it's hard enough walking every day. Let's not make it even harder with them not knowing which direction to walk, and came up with the idea of putting those yellow arrows out and making the path clear, and motivating people to take pilgrims in, and establishing, not that he personally established, but through his work, the establishment of the whole albergue system focused on pilgrim support. It's incredible.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was just looking up his name because I'm never sure if I'm going to pronounce it correctly, but I think it was Elias Balina, and
Sounds
he
right.
was, yeah, up in Otaguero. So I think about him often, that we are all getting to walk this beautiful path because of the work that he did. And it's really just amazing the dedication that he showed to that. I want to go back to, so Mary comes, so we think that was back in what, 40 AD?
Yeah, the year 40, yeah.
So then about 44 is when James became a martyr. So do you think at the point that he sets off on foot, I'm assuming to go, or I don't know how he went back to Jerusalem, but it's been known as a pilgrimage and that, did he know that he was likely going to be killed at this point? You said that, they were breaking the law. And was this law because he was there doing the missionary work, or what was he doing that Herod would have said, you got to come back and face me?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Christianity ultimately became outlawed where it had been protected. It's a strange kind of course of events, and this is one of those areas where I could chase a rabbit all day long, so I'll try to keep it concise. But Christianity originally was considered just a simple subgroup of Judaism, and then the Jewish people didn't want to be ruled by Rome. And so there was a revolt, the first Jewish revolt. It failed. Then there was the second Jewish revolt. It also failed. Both of them being attempts to throw off Roman rule. But there was a policy of allowing, a Roman policy of allowing religions that were native to the land, so to speak. The Romans, when they conquered the land, they didn't stop worship as it was going, right?
Okay.
And so it didn't matter where they went. In this particular case, Jerusalem, it was Judaism, but wherever the Roman Empire expanded, they did not stop people from worshiping the way they wanted to worship.
Okay.
Well, after the Second Jewish Revolt, that's when the big split between Judaism and Christianity occurred, with a recognition that it was a completely new way of understanding. In the minds of the Jewish leadership, it was a completely new way of understanding God, and it was a significant departure from traditional Judaism. And well, that meant that Christianity was no longer seen by the Romans as a protected religion.
Okay.
This is something new, and if it's something new, it can be suppressed. If it's something original, then it was protected. But if it's something new, it can be suppressed.
Okay.
And so the refusal to acknowledge the Caesars as being divine, because that would be an implied denial of the uniqueness of Christ. And all of these were considered seditious actions. And so there was a reason to suppress the Christians, because they wouldn't bow to Caesar, is the bottom line. It's a little bit oversimplified, but it's the basic answer.
So would James known then that he was likely marching to his death at this point?
Yes. Yeah. Stephen, the first deacon, had been killed under who would later become the Apostle Paul, by Paul's command. And there had not yet been an apostle killed. James was the first apostle killed. So Stephen was the first deacon killed, and James was the first apostle killed. So he would not have necessarily known that he was going to meet his death, but he definitely would have known that he was going to face some kind of trial, some kind of disciplinary action, because the church was in the process of being suppressed.
I can only imagine taking a pilgrimage, knowing that at the end of it, you're not going to arrive in a town and celebrate.
Right.
You actually might be going to prison or worse. That would put a whole new spin on pilgrimage. So pretty amazing, pretty courageous to do that. And so he became the first martyr.
Correct.
Right at this point. And then is that kind of what led to him being the patron saint of pilgrimage?
The patron saint of pilgrimage, I think, really came from the large number of people who were going to Compostela. The idea of pilgrimage at the time, and again, here's where a lot of different details can go in, but in that the first few hundred years of the church, the people didn't refer to going places as pilgrimage. They talked about their life being a pilgrimage.
Okay.
Most people have at least on the periphery heard of St. Augustine, his famous writing, The Confession, another one, The City of God. You know, the city of God opens with, you know, this is going to be instructions for how to live your pilgrimage and end up in the city of God, how to live your life and end up in the city of God, end up in heaven. That's right within the first paragraph of this giant 2-volume book called The City of God. And so when all of the apostles went out on their missionary journeys and they made their great travels, they were on pilgrimage, but they weren't thinking, I'm on pilgrimage because I'm going to this space. They would be thinking, I'm on pilgrimage because I am doing this thing which brings me closer to God. It was much more spiritual than physical term.
Okay.
And honestly, today, I think that's still a true statement, but I don't think people really recognize that, because why do we go and do the physical? We go and do the physical in order to connect to something higher. Again, as clearly a person of Christian faith, that something higher is God, and I know God through the person of Jesus Christ. But everyone that you meet don't use total terms. Almost everyone you meet on the Camino, if you talk with that person for any length of time, there's something that they're seeking out of the experience. They're trying to connect to something that's outside of themselves. And whether they see that something is God, whether they see it as a higher level enlightenment, whether they see it as simply being able to put to bed some negative experience in their life, the pilgrimage is still a spiritual activity. Somewhere in the early Middle Ages, we attached a physical component to that, and the attachment of that physical component, I think, really enhances the experience, because what it's doing is it's taking you out of what you know, putting you in an uncomfortable situation, and because of that, you're able to focus on whatever it is that you are pursuing, which can be very difficult when you've got all of the daily distractions of your normal day life. And so the physical aspect of the pilgrimage is actually a tool to achieve the real pilgrimage, and that is the life change. And the physicality and the challenge that's created there. You know, what doesn't challenge you doesn't change you is a great motto that goes with Army training, which I spent 31 years in the Army. And the best schools, the best adventures that you go on are just exhausting, challenging, incredible things. Nobody talks about the week-long class that they sat in a classroom about. They talk about picking up a rucksack every day and marching every day and overcoming obstacles and doing these things that you might not actually accomplish, but then you did. And so now it becomes this huge, life altering, I'm going to tell stories about it forever type stuff.
Yes.
Well, we see the same thing on the Camino. You pick up a rucksack every day and you go, and you've got these obstacles, whether it's the terrain or whether it's your own emotions fighting you and telling you to quit. But when you finally get to the end, you get home and you realize all those people that you have hours and hours of stories to tell, worth of stories, that you've got way more stories than they've got interest, unfortunately. But eventually we all create at least a few Camino converts who decide to go in the years to come, and expanding the pilgrimage story.
Oh yeah, I'm so glad that you said all that. And you're absolutely right. We have more stories than people want to listen to, which is why I started the Camino Cafe, so we could all talk about the Camino and what it's done for us. Which I do want to make sure we touch upon Warriors on the Way before we finish. But I wanted to just talk a moment about, so they find St. James they find the bones of St. James.
Right, and Field of Stars.
Yes. So kind of, if you would just maybe share a little bit of what you know about that. And I'm just, with you as a priest and everything, maybe just kind of educate us on, how do these relics, these bones why did that become important? And why is that such a thing that, we would walk to somewhere where these relics are held?
Okay. Yeah, very good. All right. So relics, of course, is one of those points that can be really controversial, both inside the church. And saying that, I mean inside the church, Catholic, when I say that, I'm talking about the Roman Catholic Church and other sacramental churches, such as our brothers and sisters in Christ in the Orthodox Church and other sacramental expressions of Christianity, because the reality is there's fake relics out there, right? There's no getting around the fact that there are fake relics out there. People manufacture relics all the time, and so that creates like an internal controversy. Just, is this real or not? How do we validate if this is real or not? And then outside, in the non-sacramental aspects of the church, there are people who are of one of the many different varieties of Protestant, and you see relics as being purely superstitious, without a biblical reason to have them. I would argue that we've got a few distinct biblical examples. There's one in the Old Testament. A person is brought back to life by coming in contact with the bones of a prophet. Right, so that's a real distinct relic miracle story. Then in the New Testament, we've got Peter and Paul, and one is sending handkerchiefs out. He takes a small piece of cloth and blesses it and says, "Okay, carry this to the sick person and lay it on." I can't be everywhere. I'm not Jesus. I can't be everywhere at the same time. So here, just take this and lay it on the sick person, and the sick person will be well again. And then the other is simply constantly out in the streets, walking around, sharing the gospel, telling the good news. And people found out that if his shadow passed over, both of these are written about in the book of Acts, if you want to look it up. New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts. So the fifth book of the New Testament, both of these are recorded there, that if he simply walked by and his shadow fell on you, you would be healed. And so we've got some biblical precedent for relics.
Okay.
All right. So, and without any reason to believe that it's restricted, right? That it's simply because they're holy people. And so I like to joke, I want to live a holy enough life that when I die, people fight over my body parts, because these people who are declared saints, they end up being divided out to churches, right? And
Right.
so like, the hand of St. James actually is in a church in England, although I can't remember which parish church has St. James's hand. The head of St. James is somewhere else, and then all the rest of him is in that silver reliquary below the main altar there in the cathedral. But so the body of St. James is taken by his disciples, or his co-missionaries, back to Spain, and he's brought to shore. And here is a great example of some of the competing stories for exactly what happened. And
Right.
the one that I like the best is, which is for no other reason than I simply like it the best, is I don't have a particular historical reason to demonstrate that it's true, but reading it, it makes the most sense to me, is that he's brought ashore and he's there, and it's not too terribly, it's he's buried, right? And he's buried, and the devotion to him and his missionary work and the Christianization of Spain comes about. It's interesting, like a lot of things, the person didn't necessarily see the fruit when they were alive, but after their death, all the pieces start to gel. And so we can tie it back to Mary telling James, like, no, you actually are accomplishing something. You just don't see it yet. Suddenly, after his martyrdom, the Christianization of Spain starts to grow and ultimately grow exponentially. But the Moors come into the Iberian Peninsula, the Muslims come into the Iberian Peninsula and start taking over. And it's never a good thing when faith systems war against each other. It's never a good thing when nations war against each other. It's especially not a good thing for faith systems to war against each other, for a lot of reasons. And one of which is those things which are sacred are almost always profaned in the process. And so the story that I read that I like the best, because it makes sense based on what I've personally seen in my time in the army and when I was deployed to Iraq, is that the members of the church said, we have to hide his remains. If we don't hide his remains, they'll be stolen, they'll be broken up, they'll be burned, they'll be desecrated. And so they took him out of the crypt that he was in and buried him in this field. And like, when we push the Moors back, we'll dig him back up again and put him back in his proper place. And then the Muslims occupied Spain for hundreds of years. And by the time it's all over, nobody remembers exactly where they buried him, because it's been multiple generations until ultimately he's found. And you have these three bodies found, one of which is a person who's been beheaded. And it's in the general right area. So it's like, wait a minute, we know that his remains were buried, and we know that his co-missionaries were buried with him, and we know that he was beheaded. And here we have three sets of remains, and one of which was beheaded.
Yes.
And so with a lot of, and this is, again, where do you place your faith? At a certain point, you just have to say, we trust the people knew what they were doing through prayer and discernment over what is physical evidence. But technically, more than one person was beheaded during the era. The Middle East and Europe both were pretty brutal places to live at the time. They said, we've got the right location, we've got the right number of people, we've got the right physical description, and all of the jigsaw pieces fit. And having spent a long time in prayer and discernment and seeking the Holy Spirit's inspiration, we're confident to say, yes, these are the remains of St. James. At which point they're placed in the reliquary, and they build the cathedral from there, where they initiate the building of the cathedral and the restoration of true St. James inspired Christian worship. in that region of Galicia. And at first, he's only the patron of Galicia, and then ultimately he's the patron of the entire country. And that, of course, is largely based on the visions that they saw in getting the Muslims back out of Spain, in the Reconquista, the restoration of the Christian Church and the expulsion of the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula, which gives us that iconography that I mentioned earlier, the St. James leading the charge. And again, we can't anachronistically go back and judge people. We simply accept products of their age are products of their age. But I actually don't dislike that iconography as much as some other people do. And because I've repurposed it, and if I can share that repurposing, as we all have things that we want to eliminate from our lives, right? So that iconography is, we're eliminating the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. Okay, well, that makes no difference in my life. But there are things that I want to eliminate from my life. And so I just reimagine that iconography as those being trampled underfoot, not as individuals. And of course, yeah, I mean, this is an intentional making a separation from what you see to what you want to internalize. But I see those as simply personifications of the things that I'm trying to eliminate from my life. Those things that I want changed, those things that I find to be negative, that I want to be rid of. And so when I go on pilgrimage, Santiago Matamoros is St. James, the sin slayer. And it's like, yeah, this one thing, that's a temptation that still really bothers me. And so trample that under your feet for me, will you please? Because I'm not strong enough to do it by myself. Come to my aid and help me trample that underfoot, that temptation that just won't let me go.
Oh, Father Steven, I am so glad that you have given me and everyone that's listening or watching a new way to interpret that, and to kind of see, as we're doing our pilgrimage, St. James kind of coming in on this white horse, and helping us to release those things that we need to release in our lives. And that's a really beautiful visualization and a reminder now that we can use as we're walking. I think that's fantastic. Thank you for that.
Right. There's so many things, there's lots of things. I was a history major when I first went to college, and my undergrad. There's lots of things in history that we're not going to repeat, right? And that we're not going to celebrate. But
right.
There, in the hospital chaplain world, they talk about it as reframing. It's like, what's this? I'm sure they use that term elsewhere, but it's like, what's this person's issue? How can we reframe that experience so that you can benefit from it, heal from it, learn a lesson from it, whatever. And so I just took that and said, okay, the imagery, kind of unfortunate, depending on your point of view, very unfortunate, but that doesn't mean I can't reframe it and use it for something in the modern context that's beneficial to me.
Yes.
And so that's what I encourage everybody to do. It's like don't ignore it. It's a real thing, but repurpose it for your own reason.
I love the stories that you have shared today. I think are really going to enrich my next Camino, and I hope all the listeners and folks that are watching today, I think you've taught us some really new things that I think will make a difference on our next walk. And I just wanted to ask you, as a man of deep faith and very well educated historically on all of this, what was it like for you when you got down, when you were at the cathedral and you go down and you see the relics, the box holding the relics? What was that experience like for you?
I tell you, it was the first Camino I made was 2016, which if you may recall is when Pope Francis declared it to be a year of Jubilee Mercy. So like right now, the mercy doors at the Cathedral Santiago are are open because it's a holy year of St. James. But in that year, it was all cathedrals, all the basilicas, the various appointed churches within the different dioceses. They were all open because it was this Jubilee year. It was just a declared year of mercy. So the mercy door, inviting pilgrims to come through for the sake of experiencing a unique way of experiencing the mercy that God provides. And so people were on pilgrimage all over the world, right? People were seeking out mercy doors all over the world. But I went in, and you may not be familiar, because if it's not a mercy year, if it's not a Jubilee year, or if it's not a holy year, that door doesn't open. It's a sealed door. And so I went in, and I didn't really think about it. I went through, and it is positioned where you go straight down into the crypt. That door is like right by the stairwell.
Yes.
And so I went in and went immediately into the crypt, and which threw me the next time I went, because that door wasn't there, and you walk in on the opposite side, and you have to follow the arrows to get you around to the stairwell. And I was kind of taken aback, and I'm like, this is different. It's like, oh yeah, it was that one of a kind experience because the door was open. But go down into the crypt, and there's the kneeler there so that you can spend some time in prayer. And beautiful silver reliquary on that checkerboard floor. So just such just physically, it's a gorgeous thing. It's very aesthetically pleasing.
Yes.
And you've walked hundreds of miles to get there. And so I look and I say, inside of that reliquary, that ossuary bone box, is a man, or his remains anyway, who walked with Jesus. How amazing is that? And I was like, just taken aback. I had to just completely pause for a minute. And then I started thinking about it, and thinking about all of the little occasions, which we talked about when you were so wonderful to host me on those 2 interviews. So blessed to be able to be with you twice. So little shameless plug for your show. Go back and watch those old ones, because we shared great stories.
They were.
All those just little events that I had experienced all along the way that just showed God's presence, and how he was steering me into a new way of doing ministry after getting out of the Army. I was like, that guy walked with Jesus, but for the last few hundred miles, Jesus has been walking with me. And I didn't want to move. I just wanted to stay there. And I probably could have camped out there for an hour or more. And I just kind of look out the corner of my eye, and I see more and more people stacking up the stairs waiting. And I was like, okay, I guess I gotta go.
Yes. Right. Like I remember going up and touching, the statue of St. James up at the top of that, right? And just what a special that was. But then also feeling the pressure to not stay too long, right? Because people were on their way. And I felt the same way when I went down into the crypt area, that I really didn't feel like I could stay as long. But I love the imagery of what you're saying, and I can't wait to go back and have that same thought of thinking of St. James in that way. And now all the stuff that you've just shared today, I just think that's going to be an even more deeply moving experience next time. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah. I wanted to say, I know that we've probably gone way over the amount of time that we should have, but I think this has been fascinating, and I hope that others are enjoying learning as much as I am. I wanted to make sure that we talk about, you're getting ready to take your next group to walk the Camino. So I just wonder if you want to tell everyone when you guys will be setting off, and of course, let everybody know that we will be following your journey and highlighting as much as we can what you get to do with this next group. But You just want to share how many people you'll be taking and maybe any other details you think might be interesting for folks.
Right. We've got a group, and this is kind of a miracle in and of itself. It's a total group size of 10 that does include our leadership. Myself, blessed to have Dr. Renee Phillips with us again, and then Jim Stinson, who he hates getting any attention given to him, but he really deserves it. He really helps get everything moving and working right. And a group of 7 of the vets for the sake of the healing pilgrimage. And with all of the delays and the uncertainty created by COVID, and still some, because I've reached out to the majority of the albergues that I work with and that have developed working relationships with, and I've heard back from a good number, but not all. So not quite sure we've got all our lodging lined up at this point, but we still have some time to get that worked out. But I really didn't know if we were going to be able to, even if the borders opened, if we were going to be able to execute, just because there was so many variables.
Right.
And for people to come together, and I've sent everybody the messages like, you are on for this year if you want to go, but realize that this is going to be an unpredictable year.
Yeah.
Because we've got all this stuff going on. And some of them said, well, if it's okay, can I go next year after things are more stable? And others were, I'm flexible. We're gonna make work what works. And so we had a full list and a waiting list. So full list is 12 and a waiting list, and in between people that had conflicts, whether they be moving or jobs or health, all created with the totality of the experience that we've all had over the last year and a half, or whether it's just a personal, yeah, I think I better hold back one more year if that's all right. And I told everybody, if you need to hold back a year, just let me know, right? Don't leave me hanging, because I want to pull people from the waiting list. And if you want to wait a year, we're going to automatically roll you on to next year. And so between that and pulling people from the waiting list, we got a good solid group of 7 to go, plus the leadership, giving us a total of 10. And these are some of the really most battle proven military people that are out there. We've got a couple of Marines. We've got a couple of people from the Ranger Regiment. We have a couple of people that are, their nickname is the Rakasans, but they're the 101st, the Screaming Eagles, made famous in the Band of Brothers, the TV show band, or the HBO show Band of Brothers. They're modern descendants. So we got a couple of Rakasans. These are people that are really in the Army, we say at the tip of the spear. They're really at the tip of the spear in the ongoing conflict that we've had in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And then in addition to that, we've got what is absolutely essential and we literally could not live without. We've got a person who was an RN in the Air Force being the medical support for the air evacuations from theater to Landstuhl, keeping people alive in the aircraft in their emergency evacuation to the higher level of care that's available at the military medical center in Landstuhl. And which, if people who are following the war have heard of Landstuhl, because it's this massive, incredibly high tech super facility for healing some of the most traumatic wounds that exist, traumatic physical wounds that exist. So what Landstuhl was doing for the body, Warriors on the Way tries to do for the mind and the spirit and the soul, is cause that repair, or at least be the tool for that repair for people, and so that they experience the grace and the forgiveness that's available, which is all about, you mentioned early on, moral injury, and most people have heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and moral injury is is its close cousin. And that's when, whether you actually did something wrong or not, you just can't get over the feeling that you have, particularly experienced in the way of some sense of guilt. And sometimes a person has done something, bad things happen. Even in the best intentions, bad things happen. So sometimes there's a legitimate source for a sense of guilt, and other times there's not. But that doesn't matter. What matters is how the person is interpreting their experience. And so you have people who have a sense of guilt, and it's like, I know you feel guilty, but grace is available, forgiveness is available. And with that, I know you said a minute ago that we've gone probably longer than intended, but I want to share one last great cathedral story. And this was recorded. This was recorded by the Venerable Bede. I'm going to have to pull up. He's got this. Oh shoot! Let me find it. There it is. This is recorded by the Venerable Bede, and he lived 673 to 735. And in the Book of Miracles of St. James, which was recently translated into English and published by Italica Press, if anybody wants to look it up and get a copy, you can find a copy. There's 22 miracles, and it's great. The person who records them says, if I was to record all the miracles, there wouldn't be enough paper available. And he goes, so I've only recorded the ones that are the most highly documented from the most trustworthy sources. And so the Venerable Bede was a church historian living in the dates that I just mentioned, and I'll paraphrase it for the sake of time. A man goes into confession, and he confesses some sin, and we're never told in the story of the miracle what he confessed, but it was such an atrocious sin that the person who was hearing his confession says, yeah, I don't even know what to do with that. That's too much for me to address. This is what you need to do. You need to go to the cathedral and go to the bishop and confess to him, because he's way more experienced and knowledgeable than I am. And he'll know what to do, and he'll know how to properly advise you. And well, the guy gets to the cathedral, and he's reticent to go to the bishop. And so he writes out his sin on a piece of paper, and he slips it onto the altar before the Mass begins, knowing that the bishop was going to celebrate the next Mass. And so the bishop comes in, and he picks up this piece of paper, and he looks at it, and the person who's trying to make his confession is watching a little bit from a distance, and he doesn't see any reaction in the bishop. There's no recoil. There's no visible disgust in his face or anything. And so he goes running up there, and he says, I left you that note. That's my confession. And I'm just throwing myself on your mercy. I was told to come here to receive penance from you. And the bishop takes the piece of paper, and he holds it up. He goes, this is blank. There's nothing on it. And he says, well, I've got this sin to confess and penance to receive. He says, I cannot give you penance for what Christ has already absolved. Because he took the fact that the page had been erased as the sign that God had already forgiven the sin.
Wow.
And he says, as a matter of thanks, he says, next week on the anniversary of today, in 6 days, fast the next day, but there is no penance. Your sins are already absolved. And when Venerable Bede recorded that story, he gave this as a comment on the end. And he says, it is to be understood from this that whoever is truly penitent and is from faraway shores and has sought to request forgiveness from the Lord and help from St. James in Galicia, without doubt, will have the slate of his sins wiped clean in eternity. May Jesus Christ our Lord deign to guarantee this, who lives with the Father and the Holy Spirit, who reigns as God, world without end. Amen.
Oh, wow.
And so what we do with Warriors on the Way is we collect soldiers and sailors, airmen and Marines, people who have gone off and done what the country called them to do that needed to be done, and as a result are struggling with what they experienced, and say, let's go and put you in a position to have that wiped clean. And as we discussed in the earlier interview, from the beginning of the pilgrimage to the end of the pilgrimage, we're consistently showing a group average of 70% reduction in symptoms. And that puts people in a place where they realize that they can be better. They realize what it feels like to feel normal again, and places them in a mindset where they're more apt to and willing to seek out continuing care and continuing healing opportunities once they get home. And that's what it's all about. You can start something, but you have to continue in it. In one of the Gospels, Jesus says, abide in me and I'll abide in you. And the same is true in the healing process. Abide in healing, and healing will abide in you. You can't quit medication early, and you can't quit the healing process early. You have to take what's been started and continue in it.
That really resonates. Yeah, I like that. Well, I want to encourage everyone to go back and watch our interviews from January. We did 2. And I will tell you, Father Steven's interviews were fantastic, not because I was doing an interview and Corey was doing the interview with me, but because of his deeply touching stories of his own Camino, as well as the other warriors that he's taken. So I encourage everyone to know that, this is an organization that was born out of his Camino, and I think a very, very worthy cause to support. So I hope that you will check out warriorsontheway.org and learn more about what he's doing, and get ready to watch their next trip, because you guys are going to be stepping off in September.
September 17. Yep, September 17. Everybody gathers here in San Antonio, and we issue out everybody's equipment. It is, like you mentioned early on, it is a 501c3. We make sure everybody gets all their supplies from the many generous donors all around the country. So I'll ask your viewers to take a look at the website and consider if this is something you want to support, because we need all the help we can get, because we make sure that nobody is denied the opportunity for lack of ability to pay. Everybody who's selected and goes on the trip is fully sponsored, meaning their airfare, their ground transportation, their meals, their lodging, the backpack, the trekking poles, the sleeping bag, everything is provided for their use, so that all they need to do is show up with passport in hand and the clothes they're going to hike in. And we have a wonderful time.
Yeah, and any amount will help. As everybody that's watching this knows, that going on your Camino, there are definitely a lot of costs associated. So anything that we can do as fellow pilgrims to offset those costs would be really appreciated, I know, by the warriors that get to go. And so please check out the website and consider donating as much as you can. If you've enjoyed this conversation today, Father Steven's project of Warriors on the Way is a labor of love, and he came today to share with us the story of St. James. And so if you've enjoyed the conversation today, and also hearing about what he's doing with Warriors on the Way, we hope that you will maybe feel moved to help out in some way. So thank you so much, Father Steven, for being here today. As the Camino geek, I am super excited about the things that you've shared, and I know that it's going to enrich my next Camino, so thank you so much. And I just wondered if you could close us out maybe with a prayer from St. James, and I am going to ask if you're willing to do that, and then I'm going to have to ask you to stop our recording, because I had to make you host to do that share, so maybe I'll still be able to.
I'm finding the button there. Okay, perfect. I found it, so I'm ready to go.
So viewers, listeners, thank you so much for stopping in the Camino Cafe. We are just thrilled that you came today to hear more about St. James. And I hope, if you haven't yet walked to Camino, I hope that something that you've heard today will encourage you to go and take that pilgrimage. So we will close out once Father Steven's done with the prayer. That will be the end of this call. So thank you, everyone. Please remember the t-shirt giveaway. So if you can name the locations of the pictures that Father Steven shared earlier, please do so. And we hope to see you back here at the Camino Cafe really soon. And happy St. James Day. Father Steven, the floor is yours.
All right. St. James, apostle, chosen among the first. You were the first to drink the cup of the Master, and you are the great protector of pilgrims. Make us strong in faith and happy in hope on our pilgrim journey, following the path of Christian life, and sustain us so that we may finally reach the glory of God the Father. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you so much.